I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy in the context of the burning issues of the day. I'm not joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, this week. He couldn't make it. So you get me as a solo performer here on this week's Libertarian Angle. I thought I'd use this as an opportunity to talk to you about our current ongoing conference, the National Security State and the Kennedy Assassination. Now, over the years, people have asked me, what relevance does the Kennedy assassination have to people that are living today? I mean, the assassination took place more than 50 years ago. Are we talking about just a historical event? And my answer is always on the contrary. It's a direct line from the Kennedy assassination, and even before, to where we are today, in terms of the national security state form of governmental structure under which we live, the program of state-sponsored assassinations that is now right out in the open, the indefinite detentions, the forever wars, the alliances with dictatorial regimes, the coups, the regime change operations. It's just one long continuum, and the Kennedy assassination is simply part of that continuum. And that if we're going to get back to where we need to be in this country, a society based on peace, prosperity, harmony, morality, liberty, it's necessary to face discomforting truths. And the biggest discomforting truth is with respect to this national security state way of life, with including its many, many regime change operations, both foreign and domestic, along with all of its weird, perverse programs. I mean, like take MK Ultra. I mean, how could you come up with a more perverse program than that? Here you are subjecting American citizens to unlawful, illegal, illegitimate, immoral drug experiments. And then when they come out and it's disclosed, what does the CIA do? They intentionally destroy all their records to prevent the American people from learning the full extent of what they were doing and how they were doing it and the people to whom they were doing it. So by understanding the Kennedy assassination, you can start to get a sense of the pattern of things that were taking place back then and that have continued taking place ever since. As I've pointed out many, many times, America was started as a constitutionally limited government republic. That meant a government with very limited powers. In fact, the powers were enumerated in the Constitution itself. If a power wasn't enumerated in those few enumerated powers, it could not be exercised. And if you had told the American people that the Constitution was going to bring into existence a national security state, they never would have approved the deal. There is no doubt about that. If you had told them that they were going to have the type of governmental system we have today and have for since World War II, they would have said no. And they would have continued operating under the Articles of Confederation. They didn't want a government that had the power to assassinate anyone, including an American president or including a foreign official. There was no power of assassination among the limited enumerated powers. And so it's not surprising that there were no state-sponsored assassinations prior to World War II on the part of the federal government. That all changes after World War II. That the argument was that, we're now facing this implacable foe, the Soviet Union, which, interestingly enough, had been America's World War II partner and ally. But as soon as Nazi Germany is defeated, man, everything changes. And the U.S. officials say, well, now we need to convert into a national security state, which is a totalitarian form of governmental structure, in the sense that it wields omnipotent, non-reviewable powers, including the power to assassinate people. Now, if you look at the Bill of Rights, it expressly states that no person shall have his life taken away from him without due process of law. And due process of law is a term that stretches all the way back to Magna Carta. It involves notice and trial or hearing. You got to give notice to a person what he's being charged with and give him an opportunity to defend himself. In other words, no assassinations, because assassinations don't involve due process of law. But when the government changed to a national security state, that effectively nullified the Bill of Rights, even though it was done without a constitutional amendment. It's just the nature of the structure. I mean, President Eisenhower pointed this out in his farewell address. This was in 1961, where he says, okay, we've got this newfangled system. He called it a military-industrial complex. It's the same thing, deep state, whatever term you want to use for the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, and to a certain extent, the FBI. That this, Eisenhower pointed out, this is a newfangled way of life for America. Now, he said it was necessary because of the Cold War. He bought into that nonsense. But he said this is a grave threat to the democratic processes of the American people. It's a powerful force within the government, and it's a dangerous force. He wasn't the only one. When John Kennedy becomes president, he recognizes the dangers of this. And those of you that have watched the first 3 segments of our conference can now understand what was going on with this relationship between Kennedy and the military-industrial intelligence complex. He comes into power as under suspicion. Now, he was a standard Cold Warrior. Most Americans were. I'd say about 99% of Americans had bought into this concept that was being promoted by the Pentagon, the CIA, that there's an international communist conspiracy. It's hell-bent on taking over the world and the United States. It's slowly creeping to our land, both within the minds of people as well as just enveloping countries. That Kennedy comes in with this mindset, with an exception, though. As we pointed out in our conference, he sides with third world countries against colonial powers like Britain and Belgium and France, and says, hey, these people are just fighting for independence. And boy, this set off the alarm bells in the Pentagon and the CIA, because their position was absolutely not. These are communist-directed movements, and that when these independence movements prevail, they're going to be part of the communist conspiracy that's going to slowly but inevitably take over the world, including the United States. So Kennedy comes into office under suspicion right off the bat. Now, an example of this is our speakers have pointed out in our conference, the CIA decided that they needed to assassinate the Congo leader, Patrice Lumumba. He was one of the leaders of one of these independence movements, and therefore he was a communist. But they knew that Kennedy sympathized with these third world movements, so they orchestrated Lumumba's assassination and accelerated the assassination schedule so that they could kill the man who was totally innocent. I mean, it showed that their mindset, they were willing to assassinate an innocent person that they believed merited assassination because he was a communist. And they orchestrated that within 2 or 3 days before Kennedy became president, to ensure that they got the job done before the president could nix it. This is the type of arrogance, the hubris that existed within the CIA, but it was also within the military, as we've shown in the last presentation we had. The relationship between the military and Kennedy, it started out bad and it just deteriorated. It started out with deception with respect to the Bay of Pigs invasion. Deception not only by the CIA, I mean, that's been established, but as came out in John Newman's talk, there's this tension between the military because they're deceiving Kennedy too on the Bay of Pigs. And then after that fiasco, you've got the military exhorting Kennedy to invade Cuba, because by this time, Cuba had turned communist. Fidel Castro had taken power. And they said America couldn't stand. I mean, this was proof that the communists were coming to get us, that 90 miles away from American shores, that the communists were here. But, I mean, Cuba never attacked the United States. They never threatened to attack the United States. They never had the ability to invade the United States. But all this fear of, Cuba's going to come and get us. Cuba's going to come and get us. And most revealing is their Mafia partnership, the CIA's Mafia partnership. Imagine partnering with the most evil criminal organization in the world. And they're partnering with him to assassinate Fidel Castro. Now, we've all just grown up with this. Standard. And the mainstream press makes jokes about, exploding cigars, yuck, 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 and they yuck it up. But they ignore the real significance of this. They're killing a person that has done nothing wrong. I mean, just because a person's a communist, that was their mindset. If he's a communist, he's a threat to national security, and therefore we can kill him. Where is that authority? Morally, where is the authority? Legally, where is the authority? Constitutionally, where is the authority? But nobody questioned that. Certainly not the courts. The courts were never going to question anything the national security establishment decided was in the interest of national security. So in the relationship with Cuba, Americans were told, they're the aggressors. The communists are the aggressors. In fact, when you look at it in a real sense, the U.S. was always the aggressor against Cuba. It still is. It imposed this brutal embargo with the intent of impoverishment and killing the Cuban people until they overthrow the Castro regime and put in another pro-U.S. dictator like Fulgencio Batista, the corrupt, brutal dictator who preceded Castro, but who was pro-U.S. That's what this whole embargo is about. And then you've got the assassination attempts. You've got this strangulation of Cuba. You've got criminalizing Americans' travel to Cuba, spending money there. There's no question the U.S. has always been the aggressor. So what we're establishing here is the deteriorating nature of the relationship between Kennedy and the national security establishment, and then it proceeds into the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Castro, he knows that the Pentagon and the CIA are pushing for an invasion. He's not ignorant of this, and of course there was Operation Northwoods, which was a plan that was kept secret for 30-something years, where the military told Kennedy, let's just attack ourselves and say that it was Cuba's agents that did it and kill innocent people in the process, innocent Americans, but they just have to be sacrificed for the greater good because then we can invade Cuba. And Kennedy said, absolutely not. And then so Castro knows about all these plans to invade, so he gets the Soviet Union to put in nuclear missiles there, not to attack the United States, as the mainstream press and the national security establishment often allege, but rather just to defend, or actually to deter an attack. Well, as soon as those missiles come due, the fight between the military and Kennedy, man, it skyrockets because the military is saying, you need to invade, you need to invade. And Kennedy's resisting this. Now, let me back up a second. You recall Eisenhower's warnings about the power of the military intelligence establishment. Well, Kennedy believed the same thing about how dangerous this force was. And so he read a book called 7 Days in May about the power of the military here in the United States to remove a president and take control for purposes of national security, to protect national security. And he was so impressed by this book and by the importance of the book and the message of the book that he got the book made into a movie. He was very persuasive with friends in Hollywood. He even turned over the White House to film it over the vehement objections of the Pentagon, naturally. And the book was made into a movie to serve as a warning to the American people. This is what we're facing here, the power of this military intelligence establishment. So that then there's the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the military is there saying to Kennedy, you see, if you had done what we had told you to do, invade Cuba, there wouldn't be these missiles. If you had followed Operation Northwoods like we told you to do, we wouldn't be in this pickle. In fact, there was one instance where one of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Curtis LeMay, is incredible. I mean, remember, LeMay's boss is the president, supposedly. But that's not the way they viewed it. They saw Kennedy as this neophyte, philandering president who, showed cowardice at the Bay of Pigs. He let those Cuban exiles be captured and killed on the beaches at the hands of the communists. He could have sent in air support, and he didn't. I mean, they viewed him as a coward, and Kennedy knew he had been set up. He fired the head of the CIA. Now, Allen Dulles was a powerful guy. He was one of the most revered, respected people within the intelligence establishment. Kennedy fires this guy and his chief deputy for the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And Kennedy's reputed to have said, "I'm going to tear the CIA into 1,000 pieces and I'm going to scatter them to the winds." This is the kind of relationship that exists between them. So then when the Cuban Missile Crisis comes along, you've got these missiles there, the military saying, "See, we told you." And LeMay actually says to Kennedy, his boss, in the midst of this crisis, something to the effect of, "You're in a real pickle now, aren't you?" Can you imagine a general saying that to his commanding officer, who's the commander-in-chief? I mean, Kennedy should have fired the guy right there for insubordination. But instead, Kennedy said, "What did you say?" And LeMay actually doubles down and repeats it and says he didn't care. You know, he figured that he was the guy that knew better, not Kennedy. And he says, "You're in a pickle." And Kennedy, perhaps to his credit, doesn't take the bait and says, "Well, you're right in there with me, General," and walked away. And so then Kennedy commits the ultimate heresy. He cuts a deal with the communists. Now, it's often said by the mainstream press and the mainstream historians that Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union, blinked in the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's not true. It's actually Kennedy who blinked, and it's a good thing he did, because they were right on the edge of nuclear war. They just right. If what the CIA didn't know, what Kennedy didn't know, was that the Soviet commanders on the ground in Cuba had been given battlefield authority to use their nuclear weapons, and that the nuclear weapons were fully armed. So if troops had come in invading, or if bombs started dropping, there's just no question that those Soviet commanders, in a last gasp attempt, would have used those nuclear missiles. They were tactical nuclear missiles, and then that would have caused the whole thing to start being unleashed. There's no way that Kennedy would not have responded by firing nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union, and that's what the military and the CIA were exhorting Kennedy to do. Now, Kennedy cuts a deal with the Soviet Union where he says, "Okay, if you guys will withdraw your missiles, I will pledge that there will be no invasion of Cuba." Castro says, "Fine. That's what the missiles were there for." And Khrushchev throws in a last minute deal where he says, "Well, I want you to remove your missiles from Turkey and Italy, Turkey and I think it was Italy, at least Turkey, and that are pointed right there at the Soviet Union." I mean, it's like no different from the missiles in Cuba that pointing at the United States. And Kennedy agrees to do that secretly. He says, "Well, okay, let's cut the deal, but keep it secret because this could hurt me politically." So the Soviet missiles are withdrawn, and Khrushchev and Castro got what they wanted. That there would be no invasion of Cuba, no more regime change. Well, you can imagine the consequence within the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA. I mean, this was heresy. This was cowardice. This was treason. As one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, this is the worst defeat in American history. Why? Because Kennedy had left this communist threat to the United States, a threat that essentially said the United States can't survive with a communist regime in Cuba, and had left them there permanently. He had guaranteed that the U.S. would no longer invade. It's incredible. Well, at this point, Kennedy experiences this tremendous breakthrough and realizes, you know what? This whole racket is just bad news for America. It brought us to the edge of nuclear war. Kennedy, of course, had kids. He realized that how many kids would be destroyed in a nuclear war. And so he says, no more. And so now this is where it's important to place the Kennedy assassination in the context of other Cold War regime change operations. I mean, if you look at Iran in 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister, democratically elected, they ousted him. Why? Well, what's the point of ousting a guy? What, because they don't like him? No, they said that he was communist leaning. You see, he had taken over the British oil interests there, and that therefore, if he's going to be leaning toward the communists, this is a threat to national security. And they believed it. They truly believed this. 1 year later, in 54, they go into Guatemala. Democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, but this guy's a socialist. He's not ostracizing communists like in the United States with, McCarthy hearings and have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? He's bringing communists. Communists are a faction there in Guatemala. He puts them into his regime. He befriends Cuba, the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc countries. He says, what's the point? Why can't we just live in peaceful, harmonious relationships here? I got nothing against them. And, well, in the eyes of the national security establishment, that was it. That was the line that was drawn, that we couldn't stand a communist regime there in Guatemala. Now, this is, 6 or 7 years before Castro took over in Cuba. So they go in and they orchestrate a regime change operation where they've got a target list for assassinations. And Arbenz had to have been at the top of that list. They won't tell us who was on the list yet because they say that would threaten national security today on a coup that was in 54. But Arbenz had to have been at the top of the list, and he fortunately escaped with his life. But it shows you the mindset. We got to get rid of this guy because he poses a threat to U.S. national security, because he's befriending the communist world. 10 years after the Kennedy assassination, you have a classic example of what happened in November 63. You've got the executive branch fighting with the national security branch. And the national security branch is a branch of government. We like to think of it as falling under the executive branch. This is nonsense. It is so powerful, it's so independent that it is essentially its own branch of government. And Chile proved this. Now, this was a coup that was instigated by the U.S. The Chilean military wasn't interested in a coup. In fact, the head of the entire Chilean armed forces, a guy named Rene Schneider, a family man, very honorable man, totally innocent man, said, no, we're not going down this route. When the U.S. said, hey, we got to get rid of Allende, because the argument was Allende is a socialist. He's democratically elected, but he's socialist. He's befriending the Soviet Union and Cuba. This is posed as a threat not only to the United States, but to Chile. So they have to convince the Chilean national security establishment that their own president, democratically elected, poses a threat to national security in their own country. That's because they're not going to get very far if they say, would you please have a coup to protect the U.S. national security? Well, Schneider says no. The Constitution of Chile doesn't provide for this as a coup to remove a president. We're going to have to wait till the next election. Impeachment hadn't worked. That had not succeeded. Well, the U.S. position was the Constitution is not a suicide pact. If a president's policies are bringing down the country, it's going to result in a communist takeover. It is your job to act as the national security establishment. That's the whole idea of a national security state, to protect national security, and they are the ultimate arbiters of national security. And so when Schneider said no, the CIA simply conspired to kidnap him, and then assassinate him. And he was left dead, shot dead on the streets of Santiago. And when his family later sued in federal district court for the wrongful death of their father and their husband and so forth, the court said, no, you can't sue somebody for murdering your father. The courts here are not to second-guess the national security state. This is a political question. We're not experts here. Well, this fight between the national security branch and the executive branch, Allende and the military intelligence faction, was brutal. I mean, they surrounded the National Palace with tanks, with infantry. They were firing missiles trying to assassinate him into the National Palace. And Allende was fighting back. He had a military helmet on. He has aids. He had high-powered weapons. They were fighting back, but there were no force. The executive branch was no force to combat the national security branch. And Allende ultimately ended up dead. And the national security branch took over. Well, this has real lessons over here, because when you put this in the context of what was going on in the United States and during the Cold War, here's Kennedy, who experiences this breakthrough after the Cuban Missile Crisis and says, we're going to end this racket. He goes to the peace speech at American University in June of '63, where he says, "I'm declaring the Cold War over." Whoa. He had not consulted with the military or the CIA before he delivered this speech. He deliberately avoided them. He didn't trust them anymore. They were at war. At this point, they're at war. But now Kennedy is really throwing the gauntlet down. Like, who's going to control this country? What direction? Well, the Cold War was the justification for converting the federal government to a national security state. No Cold War means you don't need a Pentagon anymore. You don't need a Joint Chiefs of Staff. You don't need a CIA and NSA. You can restore a limited government republic to our land. But in the eyes of the national security establishment, Kennedy's doing no different from Mossadegh, Arbenz. In fact, he's much worse because he's a domestic president. I mean, these guys were foreign presidents who ostensibly posed a threat to U.S. national security by befriending the communist world. This is a U.S. president who is befriending the communist world. Kennedy says in his speech, we're going to live in peaceful and harmonious relationships with the Soviet Union. He later starts reaching out to Cuba. He enters into a nuclear test ban over the vehement objections of the national security establishment. He orders a pullout of combat advisors out of Vietnam. He had put no combat troops there, but he orders 1,000 troops to be withdrawn, and he tells aides, as soon as I win the '64 election, we're out of there completely. Well, so here you have a U.S. president that is doing really significantly worse than these foreign presidents and prime ministers. What choice did the national security establishment have? Now, those of you that are familiar with my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, and The Kennedy Autopsy 2, know that this is one of the real ways to understand the who of the assassination. The watershed book in this area is by Douglas Horn, who's going to be one of our speakers. We've got several speakers that they're going to talk about the medical evidence in this, because once you establish that you have a fraudulent autopsy, well, the gig's up. Now, it's often said, oh, well, if the national security establishment had orchestrated this assassination, someone would have talked. Well, that's not necessarily true. The policy has long been within the CIA, you don't ever talk about assassinations. And that was the whole point of assassinations, that they would be covert. In fact, they had an assassination manual as early as 1952, where they talked about how to keep the U.S. role in assassination secret. And the policy always, you never put anything to writing with respect to an assassination. So, and I mean, you're dealing with murder here too. If you take, for example, Gianni Rosselli. Now, he was the liaison between the Mafia and the CIA on the assassination conspiracy to assassinate Castro. Somebody killed Rosselli. I mean, his body parts were found in a can floating in Miami Harbor. Nobody's ever talked about who killed Rosselli. But the fact is that in the Kennedy assassination, people did talk a lot. Not about the assassination, but about the autopsy. And it's through the autopsy that you figure out the who of the assassination. And you'll see that as we go on in this conference. That once you establish a fraudulent autopsy, there is no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. It has to be part of a cover-up. There's just no other way to explain it. And you'll see how and why of the fraudulent nature of the autopsy as we proceed in our conference. So if they're using a fraudulent autopsy, they're covering up the crime. Well, who are they covering up for? Well, they're not going to cover up for the communists, so you can eliminate the communists as part of this conspiracy. The fact is they were covering up for themselves. But they kept that cover on for 3 decades, mostly. There were some leaks, but they swore everybody to secrecy during the autopsy. They threatened them with criminal prosecution, with court-martial, if they ever talked about what they had seen. But then in the 1990s, with the Assassination Records Review Board, the dam partially broke open, and people started talking, big time. And that's when we learned the fraudulent nature of the autopsy. Now, by this time, though, the secrecy had by and large worked, because the mainstream press was scared to death or indifferent. They didn't want to get involved in this. A lot of Americans were indifferent to it. But then there's some of us that said, no, you can't be indifferent to this. This is part of our country's national security state legacy. And it, like I say, it's a direct line from that to where we are today. Now, I know that there's a lot of people that they just don't want to consider this possibility. It's just, I don't want to think about it, Jacob. I don't want to think about it. The fact that the national security establishment, okay, they may have assassinated foreign leaders like Lumumba. They may have gone in there and had coups, regime change operations, but they would never do it here in the United States. And, of course, my question is, really? What if a president really did pose a threat to national security? My hunch is a lot of people, especially right-wingers, would love it for the national security state to save America by going in there and removing that president. Again, under this rationale that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. So, and some people just say, if the military and the CIA don't want us to know, then we shouldn't know. You saw this mindset in the Iraq War where, weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction. There was a lot of Americans that said, hey, they know something that we don't know. We can't question them. That we got to trust them. They're our leaders. And that was the mindset back in 1963. These are our leaders. This is the military, the CIA. We have to trust them, the Warren Commission and so forth. And so they don't want to know. It's like if they don't want us to know, then we shouldn't know. But then there's those that say, well, we want to know. We need to know. The truth is important. And that's what this conference is about. But it's oriented to people who, over the years, have said, well, it's interesting. The Kennedy assassination is interesting, but it's very complicated, very confusing, in large part because of all these alternative theories that the national security establishment has put out to confuse people. So I said, I want to put a conference on oriented toward the educated layman, many of whom are libertarians. Obviously, we're a libertarian foundation. Our mailing list consists of libertarians mostly. These are, I want to orient this conference to people that want to know, but haven't had the time to delve into the literature, not sure what to read, where to get started. And so I've told all my speakers I want a 101 conference, like to college freshman class, that I want you to see from the beginning in a very scholarly, well-presented way the relationship that Kennedy had, the why of the assassination, why it was necessary to remove him from their perspective in terms of national security, how this fits in with everything that was going on in the Cold War, and most important, how this leads to where we are today. And that's really the important thing, is where are we today? I mean, we yearn, or we should be yearning for a society that's just a normal society, peace, prosperity, harmony, going to sports events with our families without worrying about the assassinations that are taking place overseas and the forever wars and the coups and the regime change operations. And in order to do that, we have to examine the national security state and everything it does and everything it has done. This is part of our history, because by examining this thing, we can then start thinking, well, maybe it's time to dismantle this thing, end this foreign policy of foreign interventionism and empire. And this is the way to restore a limited government republic, which is a necessary prerequisite for a free society. So I would invite you, if you haven't joined us already for this conference, to join up with us. And I have no doubts that at the end of this conference, you're at the very least, you're going to say, you know what? Now I understand why there's so many people that are so intent on continuing to advance their knowledge, their understanding, their insights into what happened here. You may not agree with it, but I think there's a good possibility that you're going to say, now I see what they're talking about. And that's the purpose of this conference, to cause people to think and examine where we are as a country today, where we've come from, and where we need to go. Thank you so much. That's this week's Libertarian Angle.